Hi everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Town Hall for Cox Campus. We're live streaming this event. I just want to say hello and welcome to Dr. Maryanne Wolf from California or in California and Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett in Boston. We're just going to get started in a couple of minutes, welcoming everyone in. So we'll just give everyone a few more minutes. As you guys are logging in on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and Instagram, please tell us where you're from, who you are, and why you joined us this afternoon. We're excited to hear from you. All right, so you'll see my eyes diverting a little bit away from the screen. I've got a few screens going on here, so I'm just trying to keep everything together. Hey, Virginia Baker, welcome. A lot of folks logging in from Georgia. Welcome. So this town hall event is a 2-hour event. In the first hour, we're going to be talking about our children from birth to 5 years old. And in the second part, we're going to be talking about our children in the kindergarten through 3rd grade space. So we welcome all of you, educators and families alike. I'm so glad you decided to join us. Few more minutes or few more seconds to let more folks log in. Hey, Jackie from Tampa. Got a lot of Atlanta educators, Florida educators. So excited that you guys are coming in. Regina Brown, one of our partners at our partner sites at Sheltering Arms, welcome. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to extend a huge thank you on behalf of the Rollins Center at the Atlanta Speech School for everyone joining us. Thank you to all of our team who helped make this event possible. We also want to thank all of our partners, our local and our national partners, and of course, our funders who make the Cox campus free and accessible universally. So thank you all. Cannot forget our 115,000 members and counting all across the US and in various countries around the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'm gonna start by just sort of saying that over the last few months, our country has been dealing with a lot. We've experienced a lot, and arguably our children are most affected. And so we wanted to convene everyone, all of our national audience and our international audience this afternoon to talk about ways that we can be better for our children and with our children. And so with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett from Boston. She's going to begin to speak to us this afternoon first, and then we'll move to Dr. Wolf. After that, we'll have some 15 minutes of Q&A. So please continue to chat us, share your questions, share your comments, and we'll get to as many of them in the last 15 minutes as we can.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you all for caring and coming in together in community to discuss such a vitally, urgently important issue that's facing every child and every family right now in this country and in many places around the world. So, pandemic, a word that we have used probably ad nauseum over the past few months, but a word that before now we had rarely used. You know, let's face it, COVID-19 has not only impacted all of us in profound and different ways, it's impacted our lives, our hopes, our dreams, and our visions of the future. And it's had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Many of the children and families that we care deeply about, that are a part of our circle of regard and compassion, are experiencing the ripple effects of this pandemic in disproportionate ways. And the reason for that is because of another pandemic, a pandemic that's been hidden in plain sight for centuries, the pandemic of structural inequities and structural racism that truly has set the foundation for many of the disparities that COVID-19 simply widened, simply expanded and extended. And it has been a humbling reality for many of us to face where are we in our own journey to understand the impact of racism in our communities on the health, the well-being, the life chances, and the quality of our entire human experience. And hidden within these pandemics are children. And the questions that we have about how they are faring during this time and what the future will hold for them. So we come to this conversation with real intentionality about thinking from our spheres of influence individually and collectively. What can we do for children? What is the right thing to do for children? And how do we work collectively to really address these pandemics that, simply ignoring will only strive to bring us further down the road of complications. So I invite us into this space to really think about what's essential, as we talked about so often, essential workers. Who's considered essential now? Well, educators have really been brought into that light in a whole new, radically new way. And what are our goals and intentions around really supporting the structures, the supports, the relationships, and the system level changes needed so educators can also bring their best to every child and really promote the promise and potential of every child. So I'm excited for this discussion today, and I appreciate you all being here and being in community.
Wow, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I should say that I have a few more remarks that I wanted to share about you. Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett is a pediatrician and a social epidemiologist who created a community engagement network for families. Importantly, she's also a mom. And thank you again for that welcome. We look forward to hearing from you throughout this conversation about the importance of meaningful relationships and building a safe environment for our children where they're trusting of the adults in their environment, both teachers, educators, families alike. So thank you so much. Maryanne, I'm sorry. Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit? I'd like to introduce you as well before you get started. Dr. Wolf is a neuroscientist and literacy advocate at and the director of the Center for Dyslexia for Diverse Learners at UCLA. Dr. Wolf has done extensive research on the reading brain, and her latest work, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in the Digital World, is a must read. And also, we're so excited to hear from you tonight, a beloved friend of the Speech School, as is Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you, Comer and Sandra and Dan and all the amazing people at Rollins Center and the Atlanta Speech School for giving me this opportunity to speak to and with Renée and with all the parents and educators who I'm so glad that you have come to join, as Renée said, a community to think about what we can all do. And my particular sphere of influence is literacy, and how literacy becomes one of our major vehicles for redressing inequities. And so I want to actually begin at the beginning. Most people don't realize that the reading brain begins at infancy, not at 5 or 6. It begins in the cradle. It's like the room where things happen is the nursery. And here's where I want to say just a few things to parents who are listening. If I had 3 words or 5 words to offer as advice, it would be read, speak, and sing to your child every day as a ritual. If I had 2 more, it would be love and laugh with your children while you are reading, speaking, and singing. We know a great deal about how the brain emerges from cognitive neuroscience, from pediatric neurologists. But I want you to know that the beauty of reading begins with parents and caretakers and siblings under the crook of an arm, because that's where the tenderness, the affection, and the love becomes associated with the act of reading. And even though parents often say to the pediatricians and reach out and read, why should I read? My child doesn't understand. Well, they understand so much more than you think. And it begins with appreciation of the sounds of our language, whatever that first language is. We are building representations in the brain of those sounds, and the sounds become blended into words, and words become stories. And I know some of you believe that you never want to hear "Good night, moon" again, much less read it for the 100th time. But I assure you, so much is happening when you read to your child. And my colleagues at Cincinnati Hospital for Children, like Dr. Hutton, are showing in brain imaging that those children who are read to are literally having areas of the brain for language be more activated. And we have all kinds of interesting studies that are coming out to show us that the simple, taken for granted act of reading does so much for language development, for conceptual development, for the background knowledge that we want our children to bring to kindergarten, and also something very special. Every time a child hears something like what Frog does when Toad is sick, or what George and Martha do when one of them is in trouble, teaches the child to leave the natural egocentrism of childhood to try on the feelings and thoughts of another. This is what I and others call the moral laboratory of the 0 to 5 period, that we as parents and educators can do so much about. And perhaps if there are pieces of silver lining, one of them is that we have more time to invest in this act of reading and talking and singing and being with our child as a ritual that's connected with love. So I can't be more excited actually about all the things that we can do between 0 to 5 that prepare, that form the parts of the reading brain that later, as teachers, we help the child connect. That's enough for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Maryanne. I want to go back to Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett for just a second to talk a little bit about, so Dr. Wolf is talking about this moral laboratory and this building of background knowledge and building of sound awareness and building of empathy. How do we find our way into a child's space during this really, really difficult time where kids are out of routine, families are out of routine? How do we find our way into a child's mind and heart and brain, as Dr. Wolf is sharing during this difficult time?
So I so appreciate your comments, Dr. Wolf, and your enthusiasm, because there is truly so much potential, and that's the power of early childhood. It is also the risk, right? There we know that children in the first 3 to 5 years of life, their brains are developing in ways and at a speed that it will not in the future. It will continue to develop, it will continue to grow and transform, but the openness, the readiness, the sponginess of really all of those social experiences actually shaping the architecture of who this child is becoming and how they are beginning to understand the world is profound in that early childhood period. And we know that it truly begins with relationships. So the attachment is a fundamental part of the foundation for all of your ability to gain new skills, to gain mastery on anything in life, including reading, speaking, interacting, moving. So attachment really forms the base. It forms the foundation for a child to feel as though they can begin to explore and interact with the world. And those attachment relationships build a number of capacities for children. It establishes a sense of trust. This caregiver is going to be here when I have a need. Not that I will not have any needs, not that I won't face challenges or adversities, but when I have a need, there is someone who is reliable in my world who will be responsive to me and my needs. It's a really important distinction we sometimes misunderstand around how important parents are as their children's first teacher. It's not that you are the problem solver and the knower of everything. It is that you are a consistent, caring, responsive adult in the world of a child. And your ability to be responsive is so tremendously more important than your ability to know the right things. And so in this time of ambiguity and uncertainty, caregivers, educators, parents, we are often concerned that we don't have the right answers for children, and that sometimes pulls us out of deep, intimate relationships. We actually should lean into deep, intimate relationships during this period of uncertainty, because that presence and responsiveness is what's protective, not having the answers. So this begins from very, very early on in infancy, establishing secure, stable, reliable connections. You send a signal out, it will be responded to. That becomes a motivator for continuing to interact within the world. And this shapes actually the developing brain. It shapes the expression of our genetics and our biology. So, and it deeply impacts our ability to regulate our emotions. So if emotions are not able to be regulated or are dysregulated, or a child is experiencing an environment where they don't feel safe, they don't know what to expect, they don't feel a sense of trust and reliability in their relationships, that your brain will bias its attention to safety. So you won't have the capacity to actually learn and obtain new information because your focus will be on safety. Your focus will be on, I'm not sure what's happening next, so I have to pay attention to see what's happening next, not learning new skills, not interactive in creative ways in your environment. So the attachment relationships are vitally important to a sense of safety and establishing a sense of trust so that you can build other relationships, build new skills and mastery. Finally is the sense of power and control. So like each individual has natural qualities that make you who you are as a human being, right? So some aspects of our dignity as people are because you are a person and you can make decisions and you exist in the world. But many aspects of our dignity are actually influenced by how the world treats you. So if you exist in a society where you feel invisible, Your needs are invisible. Your pain and your anguish is invisible. Your excellence, your intelligence, your ability is not regarded in the society. That chips away at your sense of dignity. Because dignity cannot just be created within an individual, it's created in relationships. So when we talk about the twin pandemics, when we talk about the deep impact of what can happen with structural racism, it isn't, we usually, as soon as racism is mentioned, we stop the conversation right there because it becomes, oh, it's just about people being racist. What I'm talking about in the life of the child is all of the ways in which a society can demonstrate to you you don't matter. You don't matter quite as much. Your pain is not a priority for us. Your dreams are not a priority. Your voice and your experience are not a priority. You're not being seen. And children get that message very, very early on in life. They often get it in part through the experiences that their caregivers have navigating the social world, and then the experience and treatment that they can have as they begin to enter additional social environments like preschools and religious institutions and other areas within our society. And so at the end of the day, in order to really tap into that reading brain, that profound potential that children have that Dr. Wolf is speaking of, we actually have to care for that individual in a much more holistic and comprehensive way. And most of those signals are nonverbal. Most of those are the signals society is sharing with you. Are you beautiful? Are you valuable? Are you intelligent? What are our expectations for you? And as Dr. Wolf shared, we often don't think about reading until kids are much older. So if we don't have expectations that an infant actually has the capacity to begin thinking in a way that builds the foundation for reading, we won't invest in it. And so that's another part of acknowledging the dignity and humanity of children.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, one great answer.
I mean, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I want to just remind our audience to continue, our participants to continue to post questions on the different platforms. We're going to get to those questions. Dr. Boynton-Jarrett just shared a lot. If I could just synthesize and think about what you just said, what I hear is that attachment, meaningful relationships are the gateway into this moral laboratory that Dr. Wolf is talking about. That the only way to get in there is for children to feel safe and to know that they can trust the adults in their environment at school and at home. So wow, as Dr. Wolf said, great answer. And we hope that people will continue to post questions because we're going to get to those. Dr. Wolf, I wanted to go back to you for a second. So given the discussion that just took place, how in the birth to 5 space, so you mentioned reading, you mentioned singing, spending time interacting. How, I guess this is a 2-part question. Can you give us more on how we build the moral laboratory and share with us more precursors for literacy? So you gave us background knowledge, you gave us sound awareness. What else should kids, should our families be striving to build in their babies who will soon become readers?
So I'm going to do something that I usually don't do. I'm going to tell you 2 things. One, when I set out to write my first book, which was called Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, I said, what is the most important thing that I can do? And so I wrote the first chapter, even though it became chapter 4, reading begins under the crook of an arm. That's where it all begins. it begins, and this is, Renee and I I've never had the privilege of interacting like this. But the reality is we are looking at that reading brain from very similar beginnings. Because even if we look at the neuroscience data, when the brain sets down memory, the first aspects are not just the hippocampus, it's the amygdala, the areas of feeling, emotional memories are being set down first. So what we give when we literally give our own love of reading, we communicate that. Stories are the most beautiful, simple vehicle for not just conveying the information, but conveying love and trust, just as as Renee has said. But there are specifics that I want to emphasize, because one of the most important aspects of this town hall is to have antidotes to the inequities that do not begin at 5, but begin from the start. And they begin in places like hospitals. And I know the Cox campus and all kinds of efforts like Talk to Me Baby that happens in Georgia and other places, and there are campaigns like First 5 in California. It's about what are you doing when you are reading or talking to your child. Quite literally, you have words that continue to grow. It's not just that you hear one word and you know it. You begin a continuum of knowledge about a word that is connected to concepts. This is connected to the background knowledge that a child either brings or doesn't bring at 5 to the kindergarten door. And let's go even deeper into that. If we look at some of the old research studies and new ones where brain imaging is added, and we look at the children who hear words in their environment over and over again, the children from many a privileged home end up hearing 30 million more instances of words than children from non-privileged homes. This is not about money equals vocabulary. This is about emphases that we can change in every community, and that parents need to know this. I'm very, very and Renee, you know this so well, but the Reach Out and Read pediatricians are doing their part by giving at every well visit a book. Well, what is that book doing? The book is really not just a matter of teaching the child, it's teaching the parent how rituals of reading add to the vocabulary. The vocabulary of children cannot have chasms of difference at age 5. Later on, I'm going to be potentially mentioning intervention I've done with an Atlanta researcher, Robin Morris, and my colleague Maureen Lovett, in which we were able to intervene and make differences, and the learning curve was the same no matter what SES, what race, what IQ, but the gap that began was before we began our studies in 2nd grade. The gaps are beginning in 0 to 5, when we are not, as a society, working to be sure that words become the natural environment. And I'm not using words only from a linguistic viewpoint. When we talk about the reading brain, we're talking about parts that have to be developed before you get to 5. Well, language areas, knowing the sounds, the phonemes, knowing the meanings, knowing how words work, knowing the nuances of words and what the melody either conveys or doesn't convey. All this can happen between parent and child. And Renee talked about responsiveness. This is a really inordinately important part. And it has to do with some of the, if you will, bad uses of technology. The responsiveness of a parent with a child reading or talking is that they can ask the question, they can elaborate, they can ensure the child knows what that word means or how it's being used. A study shows that if you do the same story in an audio form or a video form with all the bells and whistles versus us, the person, the parent, the caretaker, the child's language regions in brain imaging are more activated. So when we're talking about all the parts, one of the things that always surprises me in the audience is that I'm talking about the language regions that have to be developing between 0 to 5, the cognitive, the concepts, all of which happens and builds conceptual or background knowledge. But I'm also talking about affect. What does that make you feel? I'm even talking about motoric regions. The more you know about reading, the more beautifully complex it teaches us about what our mind does. And I will just say to all of us, even though I'm not probably supposed to talk about adults or experts, but when an expert reader reads Anna Karenina or Huck Finn or any instance in which the heroine is jumping or leaping, we do too. Our motor regions leap. That brain's connectedness is one of the most beautiful things we're doing between 0 and 5. We're making language alive for our children. We're making emotions and concepts connected so that the inequities that I experience, including in Atlanta research with Robin Morris, that gap that happened before we get in, we can do something about. That's what these town halls, I think, can really do something very, very special. We need to change what happens between 0 and 5 for all our parents.
Wow.
It's your turn now.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to add to what you've just talked about, because you're exactly right, Maryanne, that the purpose of this town hall, this 2-part town hall, is to say enough is enough. We're not going back to the old ways in which we've been with children. As caregivers, as family members, as educators, we have to be new. We have to be better for our children and with our children. And so this convening this afternoon and this coming together is all about that. It's all about that. How can we be? As a mom of a 4-year-old, I'm always asking, what can I do better? Is what I'm doing enough? Because all of us want what's best for our child. And I'm grateful to be on both sides, the educator and as a parent. But it is true that the reason that we're here tonight is exactly what you just spoke to. This is what this convening is all about. Renee, did you want to jump in? I'm sorry.
I love what Dr. Wolf shared about how, smart interventions do work. They do work, and you can see growth for children across the spectrum. But that gap, where does that come from?
Yeah.
Where does that gap come from? And I just want to speak to that for a minute in the light of our twin pandemics, right? Parents in general want the same things for their children. They want them to have a promising future. They want them to fulfill their dreams. They want to give the best of everything to them. So if we're seeing a gap in early childhood, where is that coming from? And Dr. Wolf mentioned, what is our social responsibility, right? To really make sure that families have what they need. And I want to take a step back and talk a little bit. I spoke a little bit earlier around early childhood being this incredible time. We've also learned a lot about the impact of social adversities and traumas, particularly in the earliest periods of life. how do toxic stressors, so what do I mean by that? I mean really stressful experiences, really difficult experiences that don't have adequate buffering. So a parent that may have complex substance abuse issues, complex mental health issues, living in a situation with chronic poverty, housing, food insecurity, these all can be very toxically stressful experiences for children, particularly when there is an inadequate way to buffer that experience, to explain it, to work through it. And so these toxic stressors impact development for children. And when we think about what's happening around the country around police brutality and the relationship between law enforcement and communities, for many parents, it is incredibly challenging to have, for any child to witness a caregiver being harmed in any way. So witnessing a caregiver's arrest or witnessing any kind of force or violence against a caregiver can be an incredibly traumatic experience for a child. Witnessing this happen to caregivers who look like yours on television can be incredibly traumatic, troubling experiences for young children, adolescents, and youth, as well as adults. So research has shown this impacts mental health. There are spillover effects of our public experiences of these types of acts of violence against unarmed Black Americans. There are spillover effects on the mental health and well-being of caregivers, as well as on their children. And so when we're thinking about as a society, what our set of practices are, what our set of what our contract is as with public servants, and what's truly at stake, many of the experiences that aren't coming to the surface are some of the impacts of trauma that are experienced differently depending on your race, ethnicity, and society. So your risk of being exposed to this type of trauma will vary depending on race, ethnicity. And so it really calls us into a larger social contract and question about what could be contributing to the gaps that appear very, very early on. Why might a parent encourage a child to talk less? Why might a parent from a very young age encourage a child to be less vocal? Is it for a reason to protect them? And what is the cost? What is the true cost to humanity? So we have to begin to engage in these very complex discussions that really involve all of us. This isn't about racism enacted by one group against another group. This degree of structural racism, actually, we're all participating in different ways. So it really calls us to think about, for the benefit of our children and for our goals as a society, what do we really need to do differently, and how are these things fundamentally interrelated?
I want to pick up on fundamentally interrelated, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, because you reminded me that the same study that showed this 30 million word chasm was redone several ways and several times, looking at a qualitative analysis of the data. And my colleague John Gabriele at MIT and others there have been looking at the fact, well, several people, Catherine Hirsch-Pasek, they're looking at the words that a lot of our families are using are safety words. Don't do this, be careful, so that it's not just quantitative differences, but there are these qualitative differences that have so much to do with the environment and the adversity that they are trying to shield the children from. So one of the things that I think we need to be able to talk to parents about is that kind of language, while necessary, needs also to be accompanied by the elaboration of language for their children. So it's not that we must not stop protecting our children with language that protects, but we must in addition be aware of this other use of language that's so important. Actually, I have one other, there's thing that, so many things you make me think of. It's a good thing that Ryan's here to stop us. But one of my colleagues in Boston has done various films developmentally about children, and now she did one on aging of America. But the one about the children in America was so much centered on the effects of trauma in 0 to 3 and 0 to 5 on teenage cognitive development. So this connection between what you and I are hoping happens and what is prevented from happening because of trauma and adversity, it affects the lifespan. And if we have people listening who are thinking about the economic aspects of this, there are analyses by, certainly at the University of Chicago and by so many others, by economists who say the more we invest, they use this return for investment terminology, the biggest bang for the buck is when you can develop that 0 to 5 period, so that all of these areas are being developed, so that later on we don't have delinquency, we don't have kids who are not developing their potential because of all these things that happen in their early childhood. So I wish we could give links to all of these things, but maybe that's another service we can suggest later.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. This conversation, and I know we have to get to Q&A, but I want to bring this up because what I hear in this theme, in the conversation that's taking place, is that really social and emotional health and well-being and access to language and literacy is really a fundamental right. Should be something that comes standard for all of our children, right? And what I hear in the dialogue is that parents, caregivers, and educators really have the power to give our babies in the birth to 5 space what they need through meaningful interactions, through attachment, into the moral laboratory, and building these skills really early on that will benefit children as they grow older. So this is just very exciting. Yes.
I can't help myself, but one of the things that Dr. Boynton-Jarrett pointed out is that it's not just the parents, it's all of us have to work together. Who has time when they have 2 jobs to be doing all that I'm trying to suggest? We as a society have to work to help this. And I will add one little thing to what you said in where I work at UCLA. It's the Center for Dyslexia Diverse Learners and Social Justice, because literacy is just what you said. And I know Comer and Sonder and everybody in your center uses this term. It's a basic human right. And we don't have that. We have neglected our child, our families, our communities, and our society as a whole.
Right. Because as you mentioned, the economic impact on our society is so great. And of course, this moral and ethical responsibility that we have, but it just speaks more to why, as you're saying, all of our communities, and the entire community needs to be involved in building up a child, being better with children in the birth to 5 space.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to get to a few questions here. And I'll start with I'll continue with questions, and then a sort of wrap-up statement for this part of our town hall. Then we'll take a quick recess and come back. So one of the questions that we have, and I wanted to ask, and this is really a question for both of you, how do we know, how as educators and as families and as a community, how do we know that our children feel safe? How do we know that our children trust the adults in the environment? be it school or at home or in our community, anywhere in our community. How do we know? How can you tell that a child is feeling safe and trusting?
I think there's so many ways to think about it, depending on developmental age and stage of the child. But for children that are verbal, I think if they say they're upset or they say something doesn't feel right, I always say believe them. Believe them. It may not seem logical. It may not seem rational. You may not understand the reason. For children who are not yet verbal, I always say every behavior has a reason. There's no behavior that is there just to be a behavior. So crying, tantruming, pulling away, becoming very upset, it is not there just to be a bad behavior. It is there for a reason. And so if we see a behavior in a child that we don't quite understand, it's important not to just respond to the behavior, but to really look for the reason, to really try to look at things through their perspective to understand what may have affected their sense of trust or safety. We know common things that can undermine this can be unexplained transitions. So early child care provider is there one day and is gone the next day, and there's someone new and there's no explanation, there's no preparation for that transition, and there's no opportunity to mourn or address it. And so children have that range of emotion. They're not often given the space to actually go to express that range of emotions. So when we think about the change in routines that they may have no sense of control over, but it's just suddenly routines are changed, suddenly daycare is closed, suddenly everything is different. Children can adapt to transitions. They can be flexible, they can change, but it's important to support them and the range of emotions that are healthy to express during that time as well. So I say just really paying attention complexity of emotions that children can express and how dialed in they are to the emotions of their caregivers and providers. Because sometimes children are reacting to anxiety and stress that a caregiver actually is displaying or that an educator is displaying.
Yeah. Uh-oh, I think we're having a little bit of tech challenge. But Dr. Wolf, did you have anything to add to that question?
I would just love to leave Dr. Boynton-Jarrett's answer intact.
Yeah.
Just because you want me to say something, I will emphasize something she said.
Okay.
And that is the listening. When we listen carefully, and that takes time sometimes that we don't have. It takes energy, especially when you think at the end of a caretaker's day or end of a parent's day who's been working, and you sometimes just don't have the time or the energy to listen. But to take an extra effort to find out why they seem to be crying, especially, or why the light in their eye seems to be dimmer during a transition. I think the light of the eye and the quality of attention that we get to know in each child, those are gauges. And I think to listen and look at those two aspects, I think I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett. By the end of this time, you're gonna call me Dr. Fox, and I'm gonna call you God knows what.
I want to ask another question, and Maryanne, you can start off on this one. As we're thinking about technology, and you touched on it just a little bit, and of course, at this time, babies in the birth to 5 space, toddlers, they're at home with caregivers, they're at home with families. How can we how can we meaningfully engage with children around technology?
Right. So this is
there a way?
so I'm just going to say, I am working so hard to try to understand contradictory truths about technology and the human interaction. Because, and there's a philosopher named Nicholas of Cusis who said that when we have two contradictory truths, we have to take a stance of what he called learned ignorance. So I am trying to understand the research, and I have been doing some of it over the last several years. A lot of my colleagues are doing this research as well. But I think there are certain principles that I would like to indicate that at this moment of time, tethered as we all are to our devices, and I mean that, all of us are tethered, try to avoid using digital devices for children under a year and a half, if possible. Not to outlaw them, not to make them a reward or a punishment of any sort by taking them away, but rather to only gradually introduce them and never use them as a babysitter. One of the things that I have learned actually from a researcher from India who was called the Slumdog Professor, and he put computers in holes in the wall, and he believed that, you know, the children were going to just learn so much just by being exposed. Well, what he found out was what he called the granny effect, that a human with the interaction with the technology for the young was especially important. So I would, in my ideal world, I would be developing what I call a biliterate reading brain from the start, in which from 0 to 5, technology is there and used in good ways. And there are many good ways that one can use it, but not without an adult in some relationship to it, so that the adult knows how it's being used, and only gradually till around 5 to 7 used in any seriously long amount of time. Now, when we get to the next section, I will say that my hope is that at 5, digital devices can be used for what they are so amazing: teaching programming, coding, complementary basis of knowledge. They're practice for our struggling readers. So I'll go into that more in our second half. But from 0 to 5, my hope is that the tactile, kinesthetic aspect of reading and how it's shared with the parent, the caretaker, is the best way for us. If I could analyze all that research, and Naomi Barron is doing that right now, that's what the research is telling us. The bells and whistles are less good for language development than the interaction with a parent in a book or a speech or, you know, creative sessions. So it's a very complex topic, and there are individual differences, and we'll get into the individual differences, especially in the second half. But, you know, there's nothing like the reaction and responsiveness of a parent and a child.
Yes, thank you. So I will just, we're gonna bring this part to a close. But I just want to re-emphasize for our audience or for our participants who may not stay on for the second half, if you don't have a baby in the K-3rd space, but of course everyone is welcome to stay and listen. It sounds like what I hear is, because I know a lot of our educators who are also caregivers and parents are wondering the most important thing that they can do during this time, or any time, our entire community, is to stay engaged, continue the human interaction, continue to develop and build attachments so that our children feel safe, that they trust the adults in their environment, and that their reading brains are open and prepared to receive. So thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone who is with us on Facebook and different platforms. Just hang with us. We're going to be talking more about meaningful interactions, relationships, more about what all of this means as we continue on the path of building a reading brain in the K-3rd space and what educators and families can do.
Can you hear me, Ryan? It says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Okay, give us 1 second. I'm not the host, but I'm with the host. So give us 1 second. But I can hear you, which is good.
There we go. Great.
Oh, there you are.
Oh, what a relief.
Welcome back, because it's just not the same if we can't see each other, right?
That's true.
It's just not the same. Well, welcome back, everyone. This is the second part of our town hall. We are back with Doctors Renée Boynton-Jarrett and Maryanne Wolf, and we are going to hear more from them, sort of piggybacking or continuing along with the conversation that we started in part one. But I want to welcome everyone who's just joining us. We had a really interesting discussion, a really fantastic discussion in part one of our town hall, which was all about children in the birth to 5 space. How can we be better with children? How can we be better in the community? How can educators, how can families be better with and for children? And so if you didn't get an opportunity to join in at 4 with us, we will have the playback available on Facebook Live so you can watch at any time. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm just going to reintroduce our expert panel before we get started. And I am Ryan Lee James. I'm the director of the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy at the Atlanta Speech School. So first, I will start with Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett. Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett is a pediatrician, social epidemiologist, and she has created and developed with her colleagues at Boston Medical a community engagement network for families. Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett is also a mom, and so we're so grateful to have her with us this afternoon. She's going to talk to us more about why relationships are so important in development. We're also going to get into a little bit of a discussion on social and emotional health as a basic human right for our children in the birth to 5, as well as the K-3rd space. So welcome, Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett. Our other expert that we have, and both of these fantastic women are dear friends of the speech school. So we're just, we're like a big family, but happy to be with them. Dr. Maryanne Wolf. Dr. Wolf is a neuroscientist and literacy advocate. She is the director of the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA. Dr. Wolf will be talking to us this afternoon a little bit about technology and the reading brain and the relationship between technology and reading. And we are huge fans at the Speech School of her most recent work, Reader Come Home. So welcome, both of you. Again, excited to continue this conversation. So Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett, I'm wondering if you can start us off again. For our folks who are just joining us, I really would love for you to share out, again, at the risk of being redundant, but it was so fantastic, how we can find our way into a child's mind, into a child's heart, and into a child's brain during this challenging time. We know our country's been going through a lot lately, and everybody is sort of asking, what can I do for the children in my life? And so if you could just share a little bit about that for this audience, that would be great.
Yeah. So as I shared earlier, most of us have never used the word pandemic this much or ever imagined that we'd be using this word this much. But one thing we know is that COVID-19 has affected all of us. So all of our plans, our hopes, our dreams have been impacted. We also know now definitively that COVID-19 has had a disparate impact on different communities, on communities of color, on lower income communities. It has gone right down the social fissures and inequities within our society and widened them. And that was made possible by another pandemic, one that's hidden in plain sight, and that's of structural inequities within our society, including structural racism. So it may feel that there's some degree of randomness between the past few weeks of racial tensions and the past few months of COVID-19. I would say that these are actually aligned because of a building sense of that we have to reckon with what happens when we do not do the work we need to as a society to create an equitable, safe, resilient community for every child to thrive in. And if we're not doing that work, the risk is that something like COVID-19 can come along and really even set us back so much further in terms of enrichment, educational time lost, opportunities lost during this very critical window of early childhood. And hidden amidst all of these things that are going on in our deep sense of uncertainty are how kids are doing. And I think one of the things we'll be talking about today is that what children really need is our presence, is our commitment, is our investment in them. And there aren't these other kind of solutions out there. It's really going to be the work that we are willing to do as a society and as a collective to make sure all children can thrive. Because anywhere that an injustice exists for one child, it actually is a threat to the well-being, health, and life chances of another child as well. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And again, I'll just add something that I didn't say at the beginning of the second part that you said for me. So thank you. But just to reemphasize that the purpose of us coming together this afternoon as a community, families, educators, all of us coming together on this live town hall is to say that we can't go back, we can't continue to interact with children in the ways that we have been, that in order for us to be better with our children and for our children, we have to put them top of mind. And I think that families and educators in our community, we do have our children top of mind, but it's being more intentional about how we are with our children. And so gathering together in this town hall event is really to say, how can we be better for our community of children? So thank you. Dr. Wolf, I think you were going to chime in, and I hope you will.
Every time I hear Dr. Boynton-Jarrett talk or you, my mind is just flooded with ideas, and it's just wrestling. What's the most important thing I want to say? Well, I'm going to say one thing that is a segue from Dr. Boynton-Jarrett's discussion of the inequities and the non-coincidental nature of having twin epidemics at the same time. That is the virus and the exposing of systemic racism. And I had mentioned earlier that there were films by a woman named Christine Herbie Solmers for PBS. And one of her films was a 4-point series called Unnatural Causes: Is Inequality Making Us Sick? And I would suggest that plus some of her work on the effects of trauma all the way through the lifespan can be connected to this town hall. Is inequality making our children unable to learn? and are to learn to their potential. And I think that's the real important thing that I want to make the segue to my remarks. And my remarks are going to be pretty harsh right now about Atlanta and Los Angeles and our country. But if we look at what is called the National Assessment for Educational Performance or Progress, those are called the nation's report cards. Well, Atlanta looks like it has a discrepancy like few others between the children who are Caucasian and the children of color. So that if you think about what is our goal, that's proficient, deep reading brains, if you will. 71% of our kids who are in the category of Caucasian are reaching those levels, while 23% of our Latino kids are, and 16% of our kids who are African American. I'm a dyslexia scholar. This is not about dyslexia. This is about a failure of society to provide the same educational experience. And as Dr. Boynton-Jarrett and I spoke earlier, so many of our children come with a gap before school begins. So what are some of the things that we can, during this moment, that town hall is like a moment in a moment to reflect. What can we do? Well, we can do things as a society that are going to be absolutely changing the game. That's going to be the overarching goal. But then there are goals that all of the parents and educators right now can do that in a way gives us this terrible moment of twin pandemics, gives us a chance to examine ourselves, to take our own measure. So when you look at the statistics in Atlanta, when you look at the nation, that the nation's report card says only 1/3 of our kids, let's just forget Atlanta, the whole country, only 1/3 of our kids in 4th grade and 8th grade are reaching these proficient levels where we can expect a person to ultimately be critically analytic and empathic. It's not happening for 2/3 of our future generation. So maybe this moment, this terrible moment, is a real examination of conscience about what you called what is the top of the mind. Well, the last trip, ironically, I made was not, it's not an irony, it's the best form of irony, but the Pope, this Pope Francis, and this has nothing to do with religion as such, but everything to do with what is the moral conscience of our world, said that we must develop a new compact for education. This is before the pandemic. This is what his version of how can we change society to reach for what Aristotle called the good society. And it has to begin with, as Margaret Mead said, tell me what you do with your children and your elderly, and I will give you an idea of what your society is. Well, his concept is that we are not applying our science, our knowledge to the poor and the disenfranchised around the world, and that we need a new compact of meaning in education that begins with a whole return to the respect for our teachers, the respect for ensuring our teachers have the knowledge they need to give the potential of every child. I'm going to say something I almost never say publicly. I went to school in a little town that was poverty driven. I went to school in a 2-room schoolhouse with 2 teachers, one who did 1 to 4, one who did 5 to 8. By the 8th grade, there were 8 of us, but out of that 8, we have 3 PhDs. Why? Because those teachers were respected by the people in the community, because the teachers never gave up on any child. And it began, in this case, with reading. No child from grades 1 to 4 was allowed not to learn to read. And this is something that I just, I shouldn't talk this much because I really want to hear Dr. Boynton-Jarrett talk more than myself. But we have a reading brain that needs our attention to the knowledge, the science of reading. We need to give our educators an understanding that the reading brain is formed by all these regions being developed from 0 to 5 and then being addressed, not putting teachers' approaches in two camps, which is such an unfortunate thing that's happened over the last years, but to give our understanding that the reading brain has multiple components. Each of those areas has to be systematically, explicitly taught by our teachers alongside an engagement, the inspiration, the joy of reading. So it's like putting science and poetry and relationship. And I'm going to listen to you, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, about the relationships that are so necessary at the base of this. But all those linguistic, cognitive, motoric, affective, all of those processes have to be, and I didn't say visual, all of it has to be brought together by teachers who know how to teach all of that. Because once they know that, they can look and see individual children who are struggling in the particular areas and not assume that one size fits all, because it never does. That's enough. We can come back. I get carried away.
Yeah, and we will need to come back, especially to the last part that you said about the explicit teaching of reading, because we really, as you talk about the respect for teachers in our society and how that respect manifests as making sure our teachers are most prepared.
Absolutely.
From our higher education institutions, from our preparation programs. So we definitely have to come back to that. But I want to highlight something you said about your experience in grade school and how you and a few of your colleagues were really able to excel in spite of, because of a teacher or teachers who never gave up.
Right.
So this piece about teachers, I want to ask Dr. Boynton-Jarrett to speak to this in terms of why a teacher may or may not give up, how implicit bias impacts a teacher's mind to say, this person's going to be able to do it and that person's not. How does implicit bias or implicit biases play a role in this? And I should add, right before you get started, that we're thinking about, as Dr. Wolf pointed out, our Black children in this country, our African American, our Latino children who are immigrants, children who speak other languages. How are teachers' biases playing a role in their persistence?
So let's start from the beginning. Why do teachers teach, right? Because they want to make a difference in the lives of their children, right? That is why you go into teaching. Implicit biases are implicit. They're not conscious biases. They're not decisions you're making about which child is smart and which child is not, which child is good and which child is bad. They're implicit. So they're not being consciously engaged, but they're engaging in a way that influences behavior. It influences the tone of voice when you speak to a child. It influences the response to probably an identical behavior, right? And so we need to begin with a foundation of kindness and humility that appreciates why people go into teaching, and then thinks about, well, what is the kind of system or structure that would support teachers to do their best, given our understanding of implicit biases? And my argument around this is what happens when you get an implicit bias training, they go away? No, you become aware that you have implicit biases, but an implicit bias training doesn't erase your biases. We need to have other things in place within our society and within our school systems that really support teachers and help put a check on implicit biases that we know we all have. So what are things that systems can do to help support the best for all teachers? Well, one thing that can be done is professional development. So really helping teachers move from behavior to understanding the root cause of behavior and having pathways to do that, and then having the backup within the early care center or within the school system to respond to that root cause is really important to empowering their ability to sustain in this work. We need to understand vicarious trauma. So for teachers who work with children who've experienced profound traumas, that can have a deep impact on them emotionally as people. There can be a vicarious impact of that trauma because of the caring, close attachment and relationships that teachers form with their students. So we need to understand that and support teachers in that, or it can create levels of burnout that are unhealthy and self-protective behaviors that create distance between teachers and their students. In order for children to learn optimally, it is in relationship. So just as Dr. Wolf described around reading, the first thing is the memory and the emotional affect. It isn't exactly the words. It's how you feel when someone you care about reads that story. So if we think about circle time in any classroom, how do we keep children in those effective, deep relationships so then learning can be accessed? But it really begins with a foundation where you feel safe, you feel trusted, and you feel seen and respected. And that's mutual for teacher and for child. And so we really do have to think about what happens when you grow up in a society where race matters, where race is a factor. It is a social construct that has meaning. So we need to recognize that, acknowledge that, and then build strategies to really support teachers to meet the goal that they set out to, which is to promote the education, learning, and well-being of children, and for children to really meet that goal as well. But these are dyadic relationships. So children will say, the teacher doesn't like me. And it's not because the teacher said, I don't like you. It is because of how they feel in that relationship. And so we really have to understand that some of this isn't about what we say. It's about how we are in relationship together and being willing to be open to grow.
Wow. I should have a comment, but I don't, except for yes, yes, yes. And we didn't really touch on it in the first part about implicit biases, but I assume that these happen from very early on, even in early learning centers. This is not necessarily just relevant for the K-3rd space.
Right.
No, we do see this having an impact on disciplinary practices and expulsions, even in preschool age. And some of those biases have to do with the way in which we view a child. So we know from research that Black boys are more likely to be viewed as older than their age by several months or several years as they get older. So if you view a child as developmentally more mature than their developmental stage, your expectations for their behaviors are misaligned with where they are. So these things all have an impact in profound ways. When we think about childhood, one of the hallmarks of childhood is innocence, that a child makes a mistake, but not as trying to be malicious. So when we think about what behaviors are viewed as malicious, troublesome, intentionally trying to disrupt or be bad, that also takes away another protection that children have in our society. So we see that in our criminal justice system, who gets tried as an adult. We're one of the few countries in the world where children can be tried as an adult or sentenced to solitary confinement, things like that. So part of that does have to do with our view on culpability and innocence, and intentional behaviors. And those can be associated with implicit biases about race as well. And so if we can understand that, we can respond differently. We can make different plans. We can make different social constructs, and we can set up alternative strategies for discipline, different ways to support teachers, to support children and families, the strategies and supports that educators really need. And I can say this very honestly as a pediatrician. We have sometimes 15, sometimes 30-minute visits with children who have experienced profound traumas, are deeply melancholy or deeply sad. And as a parent and as a pediatrician, it wasn't until I really began working with educators that I had sense, what does it mean to have an 8-hour day with a child who's truly struggling and has deep hardships? And we often do not support or prepare teachers adequately for the role that they're playing and how essential that role is for that child and how much it takes and requires of the teacher to support it with inadequate systemic support. So we can do a much better job.
I have to comment. I think this is one of the best descriptions of teachers, what they come to, why they become teachers, and this whole discussion of there's no conscious malevolence here. I think this is one of the best descriptions I've heard, and I'm just so, I wish we could give this to everyone. But you said something else, you and Ryan, and that is we have to give this kind of professional development to teachers. And one piece of that development is understanding what's unconscious, but also understanding children better too. And understanding that if they have a toolbox, they can do it. So, I think there was great wisdom that Comer Yates and Sandra and Dan and Ryan did when they put us together, Renee. I think they really were so wise to do this. But the things that I would like to suggest is that if only we could combine professional development that begins with the idea you can teach every child. You can do this. And this is where science and psychiatry and pediatrics all comes together. The more teachers understand, and this goes, Ryan, to your question about what's explicit, the more teachers understand that the reading brain is complex, but it's also very basic. And we need to have structured literacy approaches that allow a teacher to address each of the parts of the reading brain that needs to be developed to become automatic and to become connected. This is complex, but it's simple too. But if it doesn't become automatic and proficient or fluent, whatever one word one uses, by the end of grade 3, you have a catastrophe happening at grade 4. Because the teacher in grade 4 has never been instructed on how to teach reading, doesn't know why some of her, especially boys of color, are acting out. She doesn't know that they can't read. And yet the assignments from grade 4 are ever more demanding. So we have an absolute catastrophe in place, but especially for 4th grade boys of color. And here's where I want to do if you will, I really want to recommend people read Sean Robinson, an African-American scholar who looks at boys of color who are dyslexic and gifted. And And what's so almost funny is that Dr. Boynton-Jarrett is just describing them. They're acting out. The teacher is disciplining them, thinking they're lazy, saying they're not working to potential as a way of masking you're not lazy or you can't do it, when he or she hasn't recognized there's a reason why they are acting out. There are reasons. What's the whole history here? And Sean Robinson and Julie Washington and Ryan, you who are Julie's student and one of my postdocs, Laura Reinhardt, we're all hoping that this work of Sean and Steve Graham and others can really push our understanding of what's going on that prevents our children at the end of grade 3, but especially our boys of color, from entering grade 4 and collapsing from then on. And this has been known for a long time, but we haven't expended the energy or the scholarly efforts to get out and go under it. So I have 2 things to summarize here. One, we need to get, and we're trying to do this desperately. I know Cox Campus is working on this many places across the country, especially under the Decoding Dyslexia people. We're trying to have a collaborative effort in our colleges of education so that the science of reading, this knowledge, goes into our young teachers. And like in LA Unified, has micro-credentialing for our teachers who are in the system to get this knowledge. And just as we have words that connote something that somehow blanks a person's mind, and racism is one of them. The minute some people hear racism, they stop thinking. Well, the same thing is now happening with the science of reading. People are, oh, we know what that is. Well, no. We need to know there is a body of knowledge. We don't care what you call it. It's a body of knowledge that gives teachers explicit knowledge to teach explicitly, not at the disadvantage of joy of reading stories and books and authentic literature, but as a combined effort to do so. So I really think Dr. Boynton-Jarrett's knowledge base and this knowledge base need to be brought together for our teachers. And the end point is to make sure every child, that's the goal, that every child can have their best shot at reaching their potential.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. I just want to say what I hear from you, Maryanne, is that the compact that you spoke about earlier, this new way of being for education is about, it's as much as it is about the teachers as it is for the kids, that we're really calling for access for teachers, access to the science so that they can build their professional competence and continue to grow in their knowledge, but access for children. In regard to what Renée is saying, is that kids have to have a way in, and adults have to help kids get there. And so this new compact this idea is one that I hope we can have time to comment on at the end, because we're going to get to Q&A now, because I think an important question is, what does this new compact look like? Given this community that is joining us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are, it could be morning, what does that new compact look like? And what's my role? What's Ryan's role in that new compact? And so I really hope that we can come back to that, because I mean, it's a fantastic way to sort of tie in everything that we've been talking about. But I want to ask a couple of questions and hope that we have time for even more. So Renée, I want to ask you this question. And of course, Maryanne, you can chime in. What is the value in asking and teaching children to listen rather than demanding or requiring that they're silent. Silent in line, in the hallways, silent at lunch, silent during the class period. What is the value in asking or teaching kids to listen as opposed to just being silent?
Oh, I think I just answer that question differently in the light of today after everything that's happened in our nation over recent events. It's given me such pause to think about, what does it really mean to listen? What are you really willing to do? So I think we teach children many things when we encourage them to listen rather than asking them to be silent, right? We are actually inviting them into a learning and creative space. We are inviting them into relationship. You can have deeper connections with people. You can understand people in your world better if you are able to truly listen with an openness to hear what people have to say. So I think in many ways, we're strengthening so many skills that lead to stronger relationships, a greater sense of self-esteem and self-confidence, the ability to work more in community and cooperatively with others, all find their foundation in actually being able to listen and receive and hear other people's ideas, thoughts, emotions. So listening really sets a foundation for so many successes, things that we ultimately call the soft skills of leaders, of great team players, of great community, civically engaged members of the community. So listening invites that in. I think the other thing that happens that's important in listening is it's also a way of healing. So think of what's happening right now. There are no quick, easy solutions to any of this, right? Not to COVID-19. There isn't a quick, simple treatment and you're all better, and not to some of the racial tensions that we're experiencing. This will be a sustained effort where sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is deeply care and be interested in their story and their experience. It's probably the most healing thing that can happen, is to listen with empathy. And so I think actually by inviting children to listen, we're helping to build their empathy, which is an incredibly powerful thing for children to learn. How do I grow my empathy? How do I care more about my peers, my classmates, my school, my community? So my aunt always says simply with children, you get out what you put in, in a sense of like, if what we give children are lots of materials, lots of purchased items, what will they give the world, right? And if what we give children, community and connection in good times and bad, to care about other people, what will come from those children? What will they offer? What will we be able to learn from them?
Oh, beautiful.
Thank you. Maryanne, I'm wondering if you have anything to add. As I'm listening to Renée, I know I'm thinking, as soon as she started on the benefits of listening, I immediately thought how you might want to add about this piece about empathy in the reading brain, and how so often we think about reading as this set of skills that will help us be able to get meaning or derive meaning from text, but we're not thinking about what listening does for critical thinking and empathy and all of these skills that really support a child's development.
Let me just make a tiny bridge between the two of you, only because of time. First, I couldn't agree more with the fact that if you have a relationship with a child and you have a toolbox, you have 2/3 a chance of succeeding. There are all kinds of other things you can't control, but you can control the knowledge and you control the relationship and the power of listening that in that relationship. I want to just spend 1 or 2 minutes on empathy, though, because I think it's one of the absolute most important endpoints or acmes of the proficient or deep reading brain. When we talk about the grade card and only 1/3 of our kids reaching proficiency, that is not my interest. My concern is that if you aren't proficient or automatic or fluent, you don't get to engage the most important processes in the deep reading brain. And those are bringing your background knowledge, increasing it, bringing and developing your inferential skills, bringing your ability to leave your perspective behind and try on another person's feelings, another person's thought. This is the basis for empathy that grows over time. And together you put inference, analogy, background knowledge together, you get critical analysis that's informed by empathy. And there was a wonderful line, and I need to bring this absolutely up to a political context. There was a wonderful novelist, Jane Smiley, who said, are we going to lose reading? Are we going to lose the novel? And she said, no, but it could be sidelined. And if that kind of reading is sidelined, we won't have leaders who read and who therefore will never have developed the ability to have empathy for others. We need every 8th grader to have developed critical analysis and empathy. That's what is the basis of a democracy that listens to the various perspectives and viewpoints. So all that we're talking about from 0 all the way to grade 3 to grade 8 to adolescence, we're talking about the development of a society that is capable of sustaining a democracy because they know how to read, to listen, to think, and to feel what others are. Otherwise, our democracy will fail if we can't do that. So what we're talking about is not, these are high stakes. It's not simple. Oh, can they read? Can they not read? Can they? These are high stakes we're talking about.
And what I glean from that is, yes, high stakes, in that our communities, our world is dependent on having proficient readers, and not just for pleasure, right? Though pleasure is great, but to be able to engage in this critical analysis that's informed by empathy. I have another question, and I think this is the last question given time. But we talked in the first part of this, as we were talking about children in the birth to 5 space, we talked about the importance of language and the importance of meaningful interactions for building language skills, and that those strong language skills will be the foundation for reading. And that as time goes on and kids learn to read and read more and more and become more proficient in reading, that they get all these benefits, empathy, critical thinking, and even enhanced oral language skills, that they become better speakers, better listeners, better writers even. So as we're thinking in the birth to 5 space, because I know we didn't get to this question before, what about, I just can't help but think about, given the conversation, that we have long-standing issues in our society, and that though our children today have been deeply impacted, we have generations and generations of families and adults who are caring for children who have also experienced some sort of trauma, who have also not had access. What if you are a parent who does not have access to reading? What if you're a parent who cannot access written code? What kinds of things can those families do to continue to build what we're talking about here? That how can those families be engaged in this new compact, even if they don't have access?
Well, we know across the world there are many rich oral traditions of narrative, of story, of passing down generational stories that teach children so many critical skills: how to solve problems, insight, how to resolve conflicts, how to be aware of safety and danger. So many invaluable lessons that are taught through oral traditions. We also know we live in a country where there was a point in time where people were enslaved and it was illegal for them to learn to read or write. So adaptations were made for sharing culture and history and knowledge. And we can embrace all of those as very part of our national story and each person's individual story. So I think there are opportunities for, and I think the thing we wouldn't want anyone to take away from this is that a parent's role is any less valuable, is any less important, is any less influential, depending on their reading ability. So I think the importance is that the parent is offering what they have to the child in relationship with the child. And the important thing is their presence and their consistency and their love. And we often won't talk about that when we talk about science. But the other thing to remember is community. You know, this is why we are organized in communities, so that no one caregiver has to actually have every skill in order for a child to succeed and to thrive and to grow. How do we set ourselves up in relationships so that in a child's social world, there can be many adults who are invested, who are sharing their gifts with that child, who are helping the child develop and learn new skills. So this is a part of kind of widening our circle of regard as to who can actually really be influential and make a difference in the life of a child. And we see in studies of kids who've been exposed to significant adversities that having a mentor, having someone who thinks you are special, that concept is a protective factor consistently. So someone who thinks you are special. So that is about how the child perceives you feel about them. Do you take an interest in them? There's no price tag on that, and there's no other equivalent to it. So at the end of the day, we have to remember that for all of the children we interact with in the community. Are you willing to extend yourself to take an interest in that child? Because it makes a difference and it matters. It matters. All of us as adults can remember somebody who thought we were special, who wasn't a part of our immediate family.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
So, Renee, I almost hate to go after you. I don't even want to add to it, but I will, because I have to. And I have to for a reason that's really odd. One of the things that I know we aren't going to get to because of time is what parents right now can do to help, regardless of their own literacy level, regardless of all the factors that we've been talking about for 2 hours. And that is, as I said earlier, technology has both the benefits and advantages and the disadvantages. But one of the advantages, and it's not, I mentioned this earlier, there have been experiments that show that non-literate grandmothers actually help the children learn on the computer with no skills of their own digitally or in terms of literacy. But it was that relationship, Renee, that you're talking about that was so important to say, you can learn this. Well, I just want to say to parents right now, we are all tethered multiple hours a day. And we have been using technology to help us. And I believe there and a group of reading scholars across the country have been working with Yale. Cox Campus is working with them as well, to get a literacy organizer of activities from infancy to adolescence, of skills that have links to activities that are free, high quality, curated by this group. Most of them have evidence behind them, and that can help practice skills and enjoyment while we are all in this very amazing moment out of time, which scares us, but which I hope that Renee and I and Ryan are trying to say there are hopeful elements that can benefit children by our examination of who we are as parents and educators. And here I will say that the Haskins Resource Library is a free resource. Cox Campus is one, Reading League is one. There are many things that our parents can do to help, but they should be part of it. That's to me the magic that Renee is emphasizing, and I would like that to be emphasized too.
Yes. Thank you, Maryanne. Thank you, Renee. We're so grateful again. I keep saying it because we mean it. We're so grateful that you guys spent time with us. And of course, grateful for everyone who's joined us this afternoon, tuned in, hung around from part 1 to part 2. And if you weren't able to catch part 1, you are more than welcome. Please go back and view it on our Facebook Live. It's very dynamic. And I just want to close out by highlighting a couple of things. Really, one main thing. We came tonight, we convened because of our children. Our children need us now more than ever. They need us to be present now more than ever. But I want to come back to this idea of a new compact and relationships. We've talked about relationships between teacher and child and relationships between caregiver and child. And the more and more that I hear from you both is we're really talking about societal relationships, building a larger community, a network where there's all of these relationships that are playing a role for the betterment and the development of our children. And so I want us all, as we leave tonight, this evening, this morning, wherever you are, to think about your role in that new compact. What is your role in that new compact? And I'm thinking about the people that we engage with, like superintendents, district leaders, all kinds of folks that lawmakers, politicians, who are responsible. I mean, all of us are responsible, but who have the power to do things at different levels. What is your new compact today with our society, keeping our children and families and educators top of mind? Finally, we wanted to mention and be sure that we included in this, because we didn't get to explore all of what we have to offer. We invite everyone, our experts here, as well as our audience around the world and nationally and internationally, to join us for our first week, which starts today, of our summer experiences on Cox Campus. And so experiences for families, educators in the birth to 5 and K to 3rd grade space. So we welcome everyone to join and take part in those experiences. Again, the work of Cox Campus and the Rollins Center at the Atlanta Speech School is grounded in the work of our 2 experts shown here on the screen, all about building relationship as a way to the moral laboratory, as we've talked about. And so we're inviting everyone to join us on a 5-week journey of fantastic summer experiences. Thank you so much, Dr. Wolf. Thank you, Dr. Renée Boynton-Jarrett. Thank you so much. And thanks to our audience. I can't forget our fantastic funders who make all of this possible, free and universally accessible. So thank you.
It was a privilege to work with you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity in creating this space.
Awesome. Well, we hope to see you very soon. And everyone keep commenting, keep sharing. Sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. The conversation was so good, but please continue to pose questions and we will be sure to get back.
Godspeed all.
Yes, thank you.
Ah.